Hi everyone, it's Alex, and today I'm doing my October wrap-up, and I read 10 books this October. I will mention that my reading was a bit impaired this month, and I'll explain kind of why in a second, but before I do that, there are actually 3 books that I already reviewed on my channel this month, and those are these 3 right here, so I won't be talking about these today, but in case you're interested, I'll leave links to those videos down below, and you can watch those there. So earlier this month, I had to get my wisdom teeth out, and the first thought that came to my mind was not whether or not I could read after, because I kind of did or got to, but it was what I was afraid I was going to say while coming out of my sedation. My grandparents were the ones that took me, and when I was a bit better, we were sitting down eating something, and I said, "Hey, did I say anything weird?" They said that I kept talking about this person they hadn't heard of before, and I said, "Oh, what was their name?" And they said, "Jane Eyre." So this is already off to a great start, but I'm not surprised in the slightest that I would talk about a book character while all of that happening, but I really loved Jane Eyre when I read it. I used this to kick off Victober for last month. I read 3 books for Victober, but I'll talk about this one first. And Jane Eyre is the story of Jane, and it begins, I think she's 10 years old, and then it follows her into adulthood. But she's talking to us, and she deliberately calls us the reader, and she sort of updates on her life. Jane's childhood was very much one that was in isolation since living with relatives that didn't like her very much. And even while living with them, she sees an apparition of, I believe it was her deceased uncle. And I mean, if I was 10, that would do a lot to me. But eventually, after that, she gets sent to school. And then after school, she becomes a governess and she watches someone at Thornfield Hall, and her employer is Mr. Rochester. And that's all a very quick synopsis because a lot does happen in this book. And I thought with this, I really liked, again, thinking of how Jane refers to us as the reader. There's a lot of elements here about woman and isolation and madness, and I thought that it'd be funny to read Jane referring to us as a condition of her isolation and following sanity, because there's also another female character in here that deals with sanity. You know, a lot of people have researched this book or analyzed it for years, and I think it's interesting that Jane Eyre is a book that with Jane, her character, I think she's very inspiring, and she has a very headstrong go-to attitude, and when she's confronted with things, it seems the outcome is that she flees from where she is. And as much as she likes Mr. Rochester and Thornfield Hall, there is a part where she sort of runs away, and how she's brave and bold enough to feel like she can take care of herself. And what I also liked about this book is that the dialogue between Mr. Rochester and Jane, I think, has a very light tone. I think it's good-hearted and has a good sense of humor. There's even one part where Jane saves Mr. Rochester from a fire in the night, and after that, near-death experience, Mr. Rochester still tries to just flirt with Jane. And then there's a part where Jane comes back to him where he thinks that she'll fall in love with him, but Jane's just basically there to show up and say, "I gotta go, bye." And this is a slight spoiler, but I mean, we've had centuries to read this book, and Mr. Rochester goes blind at the end of this book, which I thought was very fitting, because the idea of out of sight, out of mind, if you also know the details of how Mr. Rochester is responsible maybe in that phrase. But yeah, this was great. I really recommend picking this up. It's a classic for a reason, and I can definitely see why now, so I really liked this one. The next book I read for Victober was Dracula, and with this one, I did like it. I read this a lot during the night after work when I got off, and it was raining out, so it was very atmospheric, and I wouldn't really say that I was afraid or fearful while reading this book, mainly because I was surprised how not often Dracula actually shows up in this book. Towards the beginning of this book, we do get introduced to Dracula as someone that's very willing to learn about the human world and human lives, and a very scholar attitude about it all. But we soon learn that our narrator in the beginning here, it switches a lot of perspectives between different characters, that he realizes here, our first narrator, that he's very much in danger with his own life. I found the most creepy here, the characters of the 3 sisters, and then also, again, sort of omitting Dracula as a character here, technically I feel like in this book, or at least beyond my expectations. It did feel somewhat haunting to wonder when Dracula would reappear between the pages, and it created this sense of tension that I really liked. Some standout scenes to me are whenever Dracula is being moved across the world to different parts to where he can be in contact with human beings, and there's this part about a boat and how Dracula is attacking these people on the boat, and I thought that was all very chilling. And the rest of the book is very much very plot driven of that same nature of wondering what's going to happen. But towards the end here, when you feel like it would get more exciting, it sort of dies down for me, mainly because this fixation on the character Mina. I actually really like Mina's character. I found her the most interesting actually from like a perspective point of view, but there were these weird moments where the other characters were like putting her on a pedestal, at least I thought, and then just constantly going in circles about doing that, about how brave Mina is because of certain conditions. Overall, I would say the multiple perspectives do kind of sever how engaged I was with this book overall, but it definitely sealed the deal for me with atmosphere, and finding out more about sort of the lore of Dracula and its origins here was very interesting. The last book I read for Victober was The Mayor of Casterbridge by Thomas Hardy. This turned out to be a buddy read also with Wilson Shugart as we were reading the Luminaries together, and I think my way of pacing with this book certainly helped where I was reading it throughout the month, because I don't think my impression of it would have been as strong if I read it as quickly as I usually read books. This is a story of a man named Mr. Henchard, or by his first name, Michael, and he's traveling with his wife Susan and their recently born child, or at least she's not too old yet, and they basically stroll in somewhere, and then Michael gets very drunk. He sells Susan and the child to this man, and then it brings us to the present where Michael is the mayor of Casterbridge. Despite that kind of kooky premise, I expected the rest of this book to be sort of kooky, but it remains serious and thematically serious as you keep reading it and certain things happen. There are a lot of characters that weave in and out of each other's lives, but with Michael specifically, I kept trying to figure out or feeling whether or not I thought he was like a redeemable character. And I don't know if secrecy and trust is a theme in Victorian novels, but a lot of that's going on here, especially this aspect of trust where characters are revealing very villainous things about themselves to each other. Everyone except, I would say, probably Mr. Farfrae maybe, and then definitely Elizabeth, who is so pure that literally in the beginning of the chapter in here, one of them, it says, "Poor Elizabeth." Although there was a part in here that was referencing something I didn't understand, or people from like the real world, so I looked them up, and it was something about how one of the people mentioned in context here in passing was someone that makes a deal with the devil in exchange for infinite knowledge and I think power of some sort, and they were referencing that in relation to Michael here. And that sort of follows suit with Michael, or Mr. Henchard's character in this, as he slowly declines from his power of being the mayor of Casterbridge. Although it was funny to me that whenever Michael returns to this low point, that he doesn't feel as inspired to build himself back up, since he did lose everything whenever he sold his wife and daughter. There was also a part of Mayor of Casterbridge that Michael is looking into, I think, this lake or a pond, and sees his reflection, which made me immediately think of that Caravaggio painting. I think that's who it's by, but I'll put it like right here. I know it's called The Narcissist, I think, but I thought it was so fitting, and I wasn't sure if it was calling back to that. But the whole book in general with Mayor of Casterbridge, I think it's very good. I'm not a good judge of that since I don't read a lot of Victorian literature, but I've heard for a lot of people that for Thomas Hardy that this is their favorite work of his work, or at least a good starting point. And thinking of Casterbridge in terms of just setting and place, I also like that sort of Hardy steps away for a second from these characters and their oddities and talks about how Casterbridge runs in like the everyday mundane lifestyle, talking a lot about merchants and people that do a lot of their own work and how that affects everyone in the town. So I thought that was really good, and I think good context for everything going on in here. Another book I read this month was The Luminaries by Eleanor Catton, finally. It's really funny because I didn't know that other than this book being about the gold rush in New Zealand in the 1860s, that this is also known to be a parody of the Victorian novel. This is a really hard book to describe like synopsis-wise, so I don't think I'm going to try. I'm just going to talk about how I felt while reading it. Again, due to pacing, reading this alongside Wilson for this month or last month, I think that really helped. There were parts where I stopped reading these 200-page chunks every week where I actually wanted to keep reading because it's very plot-driven, but I love that Eleanor Catton knows, similar to Hardy, when to step away and give these descriptions of characters that really bring them to life. The first 200 pages of this book is a lot of explaining of what happens during the day or night in which Crosby Wells has been found dead and what all the other characters were doing at that time. And there's a big thematic discussion of when we tell stories, who is in charge of truth or who has that power whenever they have a lot of listeners in one room being captivated by a story. And towards the end of this book, it does get a bit sort of mystical where it is a big part of this structured around the zodiac and how all of that works. I personally have no idea how that works, so I wasn't really paying attention to that. But I loved this ending. It put like a smile on my face, and I thought it was very good. I don't think it answers all the questions you might have while reading this book, but I think it will leave you rewarded because I know that's how I felt while reading it. If you have this on your shelves, I would definitely recommend picking it up because this has been on my shelf for years, but I'm so glad I read it. It's without a doubt one of my favorite books I read in 2018. This month I also read To the Lighthouse by Virginia Woolf, and this is a book about Mr. and Mrs. Ramsay and their family, their children, and also people living around them. The character of Mrs. Ramsay actually reminded me a lot of Clarissa Dalloway from Mrs. Dalloway, and I love that Mrs. Ramsay in here sort of also, which seems to be a recurring theme in Woolf's characters, that these narrators know about the sort of mundanity of life, but they feel sort of stuck with what to do with that information. There's even a part in here where Miss Ramsay admits that in the world she feels entirely private in solitude, and that there are certain things about herself that she knows she can never express to her husband or her children, and that when we live our lives, we find meaning by whether it's our own reactions to situations or sort of investigating the reactions of others. A part that made me think of that a lot is whenever Miss Ramsay's busy conducting this dinner party that's about to happen, and then the very first lines of that dinner party chapter in here, she says, "What am I doing with my life?" Whereas Mr. Ramsay, in comparison to Mrs. Ramsay, he's much more cynical, I would say. I feel like Miss Ramsay knows there's opportunity for beauty and truth in life, but Mr. Ramsay is so tortured by being a tortured academic and his fear of failure and really displacing that or projecting that failure onto his insecurities towards his children and his wife. There's this recurring question about whether or not one of Mr. and Mrs. Ramsay's children request to say, "Can we go to the lighthouse?" And Mr. Ramsay always says no, and Mrs. Ramsay feels upset by that. And I think about thinking of Mr. Ramsay, I think is that he says no as a way for the children to have something to look forward to while they're still young and innocent, and what it means to dream about the next day and its possibilities. And for Mrs. Ramsay, I think it's a way for her to wanting to fulfill the request of her children to feel closer to them, and then to also feel closer to Mr. Ramsay. Later in this book, Mr. Ramsay is reading a book himself, and towards the end of To the Lighthouse, Mr. Ramsay's also close to the end of that book, and how Woolf, again, I think she's so good at reminding us of how the reader, us, can be involved in the experience by having these kind of parallels. My favorite section of this is definitely the time passes section. I thought it was so beautiful and so good, finding about how the years have changed the characters we've been introduced to. And I think out of all of Woolf's work now, well, at least of the works I've read, I think this is a great start to Virginia Woolf, in case you're curious. And I think it definitely has the most possibility for rereadability. And I'm really excited to reread this, probably as soon as next month. Another book I read was The Stories of Breece J. Pancake. Picking this up, I was very inspired by doing the My Neck of the Woods tag 1 or 2 months ago or a few weeks ago. And Breece J. Pancake is from the area in which I grew up and where I live now. And so seeing or reading him, the stories crafted here about areas I was very familiar with made me feel much more engaged in what I was reading here. Unfortunately, Breece J. Pancake died very young in his 20s. He had a very bright future ahead, and I would have loved to have seen how he could grow more as a short story writer, as very impressed, like I was very impressed with the stories here, I still felt they needed a bit of editing or working or shaping up. But I actually found most engaging in this was the afterwards written here with people close to Breece to J Pancake in real life. Otherwise, the stories in here, I think they're good, but I think they're told a bit too simplistically, in a way that you can tell the simplicity or minimalism is meant to be a form of craft, maybe similar to like Carver or something, but I feel like it was missing those thematic details that become impressed in its characters. I feel like the characters in these stories were a bit flat for me, but again, I would have loved to have seen his work develop more fully had he not died so young. And finally, I have Dear Life by Alice Munro. I picked this book last to talk about because I'm still sort of confused about how I feel about it. Specifically, when I was reading the last 2 stories in here, I felt there was no way that these were stories. They felt very inherently autobiographical. And then I looked it up, and it turns out the last 4 stories in here are very much alluding to Munro's real life. Regarding the other stories in here, though, I felt that all the characters were always in the periphery, but in a good way. Like, they weren't ignored, but you could tell they weren't in charge of the story themselves, at least for some of these in here. And I didn't know what to make of that because that's sort of how I lead my own life, by living in the periphery around people. Normally, when I read books, I do it because I want to learn. That's always the first reason. And then secondly, it's usually to always sort of relate the context of the writer based on what I know initially about them and what inklings are in the writing itself. But this one made me think very inwardly about me, which usually I don't like to think about myself, if that makes sense. So even as recently as like a week or 2 ago, I've been just rereading this every day, trying to figure out more. It's my belief that if I keep reading the words and how they follow each other, I can find out my initial impression of why I feel simultaneously repelled against this work, but also really obsessed with it. I don't know. I think Munro's very talented, and I did like this. I just, usually after I know I like something about a work, I kind of leave it at that, and I think to myself, that was nice, that was good reading, but for some reason this is making me think so intently about my own life, in a very confrontational way that I usually don't like to happen. But maybe that's a good thing. But I'm excited and definitely ready to read more Munro in the future. So that's everything I read for October. Please let me know what you read this month. And if you're doing Nonfiction November or Novellas in November, I look forward to watching your TBRs if I haven't done so already. And that's everything I have. As always, thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.